So here we go. Let's dig into the drums. First, I'll show you how they sound in solo here. And as I usually do, I'm going to mute my parallel drum compression bus here because we'll come back to that later since I don't add that in until after I've processed all my individual tracks here. So let's look at our just normal drum bus here. So as usual, SSL bus compressor with the punch preset. That's something you've seen time and time again. Tightening things up a little bit for us. And let's come back to the EQ and decapitator here after. Let's go back and start with the kick. So I've got the live kick track here and then also a sample kick, which is a D4 sample. So it's just a single shot kind of electronic drum kit kick sound. So most of our sound, probably 80-90% of our kick sound here is just coming from the live kick. Like I said, at the first video, the goal here was to get an organic, natural sound. So, and you know, just listening to the song, you know, you don't get the vibe that you want to have the drums really slamming and be the main part of the mix. I want you to take note of where the drums sit in this mix. So they're sitting farther back and they're providing, of course, the backbone and rhythm. It's not like a metal or rock mix where the drums are pretty intense and in your face. They're very much an important part of the mix, but they're very much sat back a little bit. So I want you to notice that in watching some of the different EQ moves that I've made and maybe seeing that it's a little less heavy-handed than I've done in other things here. Now, the great thing about mixing the song was that the drums were recorded extremely well, and the room track is amazing, which you'll hear in a few minutes. But I mean, you can see just by looking at it, this is the live kick track. Look how consistent that is. Same with the snare here. And, you know, everything was just well recorded and extremely well played. This is a very, very professional drummer here. So back to the kick. Let's bypass our plugins here. Pretty good sound right off the bat. So SSL channel up first as usual. High pass filter at 56, so we don't need a lot of low end sub on this kick. Now let's go from the bottom end up. We're doing a little bit of a boost at 69, so just below 70 hertz with the bell here, a couple dB. Cutting out as usual around 800 here, narrow bandwidth, doing a fairly big cut there. Trying to get some presence here at 4K, around 4.3K. And then also, of course, the classic at 8K we're doing. Again, not a crazy boost. You know, it's not like what I would do for rock or metal, but we're still adding some top end here. So let's check it out. And of course, we've got the 3-to-1 ratio compressor with a slow attack here. So we're not totally transforming the kick sound, but we're just emphasizing what's there. A little brighter, a little more presence and attack, just cleaning up a little bit of the honkiness and then giving it a nice low end push here. Now I want to point out one thing too. I've actually got this EQ automated at the 8K boost here, because I just found that in the first verse, so when the drums first kick in the song, let's listen to it first. We've got a long instrumental part at the start here. So it's still fairly mellow at this point, and I found that the top end of the kick, just for that first verse, was just a little too much. So I actually automated it down. So you can see that, you know, it's at 3.5 dB here, and then once we hit there, it's at 4.3 dB. So listen to how it changes here, and keep an eye on this knob right here. So it's subtle, but it was just poking through a little bit too much. Again, I don't want to be drawing attention to the drums in a song like this. I want them to blend in and sit nicely within the mix. I don't want, the kick or the snare to be like poking through too much. Next, tape head, as usual, one of my favorites on kick drum. And then just cleaning up some of the low end mud here, or the low mid-range mud here at around 200. So nothing very aggressive or heavy-handed here, just really tightening it up and giving it a little bit more punch and presence. Now my kick sample, like I said, it's a D4 kick, so it's one of those electronic single-shot kick samples. Let's listen to it. So it's kind of mid-rangey, but it also has a little bit of thickness in the low mids. So you can see I don't have any plugins here on it. And I just wanted to basically just thicken up the live kick a little bit. It didn't need much, but I just wanted to give it a little bit more of mid-range and then just thicken up the low mids a bit. It's very subtle, but hopefully you could hear how it just gets a little bit stronger, just gives a little bit of an extra push and thickness to the kick drum. And I'm about to get into snare here in a second, but this song is a good example of using samples to augment the original live drums. So, it's definitely not totally changing the sound of the kick or anything, and you'll see that with the snare as well. We're keeping the character of the live drums, but the samples are really there specifically just to emphasize a little bit. So that's the kick. Let's keep moving on to the snare. So snare top and bottom track and my snare sample here. So that's muted. I just wanted you to hear what the snare sounded like in the live track. And let's mute our reverbs as well. So let's get into the snare top. So it's going to be all standard kind of stuff that you've seen before. So we've got a gate on here, and I'm using the side chain on this, so I'm filtering out above 1K and below about 150, just to make sure that the snare gate is not opening up on kick hits or any, big cymbal hits or anything like that. So it's nice and easy on the release. I don't want it to be too obvious when the gate's opening, but it is just bringing down the in-between noise here with the cymbal bleed and the kick bleed. SSL channel up next. We're using the compressor here, 3:1 ratio, slow attack, fast release, coming after the EQ. It's going to give us a little bit more attack here, but let's check out our EQ. So we've got our high pass filter at 150, nothing crazy there, and we're doing a fairly big boost here at 8K, so trying to get a lot of brightness and snap out of the snare, so almost 9 dB here at 8K. Would have liked to get more, but there's a little bit too much cymbal bleed in there. So I made up for that with the sample, as you'll see in a few minutes. Now let's keep moving down around 4K here. We're boosting another couple dB, and then also at 2.5K just to give us that mid-range bite to it. And then of course at 200, we're doing a healthy boost here, about 5.5 dB at 200. So that's doing a lot. It's adding a lot of thickness and body to our snare. Listen to what it's doing to the attack as well, if you listen to this compressor in and out. giving us a nice little extra push to this transient there. Now I wanted to get a little more attack out of the snare, so I'm using the CLA 76 here with the snare preset. So it's the slowest attack we can get on this compressor, which is still pretty fast, so you can't be too heavy-handed on it. And then we're using the fastest release. So do you hear how we're getting a little more attack and crack and snap, but we're losing a lot of the body and the tail? But that's okay. We're going to make up for that in the next few steps with the saturation and distortion. But I just wanted to point that out because we are making a trade-off here with, what's coming next down the road in mind. So next up, I got the decapitator, and I've been using this a lot on my new Pro Tools 12 rig. It's got some great saturation. You can be subtle with it, or you can be more heavy-handed with it. I chose the E setting here. I think that's a SSL emulation, but I've got the E setting for a little bit more brightness and mid-range bite. We've got the drive just below 3, and this tone knob is just to the right of 12 o'clock here, so just trying to brighten it up a little bit. So let's check out what this is doing. So that little bit of saturation and subtle distortion is helping to bring up the tail and the body of our snare, helping to bring that back a little bit, but it's not affecting the, the initial transient and the initial attack that we got from our compressor too much. The REQ here is just doing a tiny little dip around 600. Just wanted to clean up that ringiness around that frequency a little bit. Then we've got the lo-fi, which looks different here, but same plugin and same way that I've used it a lot on snare. So the only thing I'm doing here is the distortion knob here at 0.2. So very subtle, but let's check this out. So this is my usual trick on snare, using this plugin just a little bit to bring up the body and the loudness of the snare without sacrificing my attack. So you'll hear how all of the kind of body and ring that we kind of lost with the 1176 here, I purposely overemphasized the front end attack with this plugin because I knew that I was going to add some saturation and distortion in the end, and I wanted to make sure I still had enough attack after distorting and squashing it a little bit here. So listen to how these play together. So it's too much attack, not enough body. Now check out what these plugins on. Now if we have these saturation distortion plugins without the compressor, it's almost all body and thickness and not enough of the front end attack. So that's where we're using the 1176 again. And there we go. The ring is still there. It still has the body and length to it, but now we've also got the front end attack back. So this is something that I commonly do, playing with the relationship between, distortion and squashing it for the loudness of the snare, but then also aggressive, not aggressive in terms of amount of gain reduction, but in terms of just the attack, using compressors like this to overemphasize that before I distort it. So that's my snare top. Let's check that out. We've got a lot of room sound here, and the parallel compression bus is making up a lot of our sound here too. So this will all tie together in the end. Let's check out our snare bottom track, really just trying to get a little more brightness out of my snare from this. So using the same gate here, cutting out the low end and the high end on the sidechain filters here just to make sure it's triggering accurately, and we've got a lot tighter of a release here. Then on the SSL channel, we're adding a lot of top end here, just below 10K. So we're doing almost 14 dB of boost here. And then we're also going a little bit lower down around 4K, adding 4 dB there. So we're trying to get a lot more presence out of this. And, like I said on the snare top, I would have given more 8K if I could, but there's just too much cymbal bleed here. So you can often make up for that with the bottom track and try to squeeze some more brightness there. Just taking out some honkiness around the mid-range here and doing a 200 hertz boost. 6:1 ratio compressor, fast attack, just squash it, give it that splatty squash sound and lengthen the snares a little bit. And that's after the EQ as usual. With this EQ and the snare as a whole, it starts to sound a little more like a finished record snare sound, right? You get kind of that high end brightness and even a little bit more low end here, and some length with that snarey sound. It starts to really come together here with the snare bottom track. All right, so what I thought was missing from this is just some high end still. Even with that in there, we still didn't get that high end crack that I want out of the snare. So that's where I'm turning to a sample here. I'm actually going to mute the room track just so we can really focus in on these close mic tracks here. So let's hear without and with the sample. So I ended up using my Snare A sample. It's a little bit brighter than some of the other snares I have, not quite as fat. And again, that's what I wanted out of this. I wanted the top end crack. So all I'm doing here is just adding more top end to the sample. So just below 6K, I'm doing a shelf boost, about 4.5 dB, a tiny little bit of low end here, just not even a half a dB at 200 here. Really just trying to get extra high end. So just like the kick, this is a good example of using samples in a specific way to augment the live drum. So I'm not trying to totally replace or totally reinvent the snare sound with this. I want the original snare vibe to remain pretty much intact. I'm just trying to get a little bit more of really high-end crack out of the snare with this sample. You can hear how the whole snare sound doesn't change when I put the sample in. It's pretty much just giving me a little bit of a lift on the top end crack there. Now at this point, I'm going to bring in the parallel drum compression bus here because I feel like we're not quite doing it justice here. And probably once I got the kick and snare mostly in check here, I'm going to start bringing in the parallel compression. As usual, I'm using a separate send here, so the same way that I've showed many times before. So just sending almost the same drum mix, but you see I'm not sending hi-hats there, and I'm not sending the ride cymbal there either, and just have the overheads down a little bit compared to the regular drum mix. So we're getting that really nice smack and attack out of our kick and snare here. Using the decapitator fairly aggressively here. So we've got the drive almost up at 5 here, using the A setting this time. When I'm using this, by the way, I pretty much just turn a little bit of drive and I just start cycling through all these buttons to try and get basically whatever gives it the sound that I'm looking for. So if I need it to be a little bit darker, one of these might work better. If I need it to be a little bit brighter, the E one might work well. So this one, I just thought the A sounded the way I wanted, and I turned the tone up a little bit here to get a little bit more brightness. But let's check this out. Listen in between the kick and snare hits, how it's bringing that up. So it's a nice distortion, saturation to give us some more thickness and loudness here. Okay, and then I wanted a little bit more aggression, distortion out of this, so using the lo-fi as well with 0.2 again. I like what that's doing to the snare attack. It's giving me more loudness from my parallel compression drum bus without actually turning up the fader. So let's blend it back in with our normal drum bus. All right, so that's starting to sound more like a record here. Now, overheads, I'm being a little less aggressive here than I would on a metal track, where I would pull this filter up, way up here. I want to keep some of the kit sound in there. Not a ton. I still want it to be, cymbal focused here, which is why I am cutting some low end here and then also dipping some of the mid range at a couple different points here and then adding some top end here. But listen to how I'm keeping more of the kit sound in this overhead track than I might normally do. So getting rid of the low end mud here, and then all these other points are just annoying kind of boxy or ringy sounds that I wanted to get rid of in the overheads. And then we added some brightness here. So a lot more top end focus, but not totally eliminating the sound of the kit. Now I've got the 1176 with the overheads preset, 8:1 ratio, medium attack, fast release. As you can see, it's really mostly working on the snare hits, and that's on purpose. I'm just trying to duck down the snare a little bit in the overhead track here, and then that in turn brings up the sound of the cymbals. So listen to how the hi-hats, you can hear them come up here. All right, so pretty simple on the overhead track there. Again, you'll see I'm not very heavy-handed on a lot of this stuff because it's a very great drummer, very great recording in a good room. And again, we want a more natural vibe. Ride cymbal, just cutting out low end, getting rid of bleed from the rest of the kit and brightening it up a little bit. And if we look at the automation here, we're only bringing this ride cymbal up when he's actually playing it. It's still in the mix a little bit in the other points, but overall it's subtle and we're just turning it up in these ride sections. Here, how we get rid of the kick there. Just trying to get a little bit more shimmer out of that. Just a little bit there to try and just emphasize those ride hits when needed. So now let's get into a huge piece of what this drum sound, which is the room track here. So when you get a room track like this, you got to do your best to use a lot of it, and it just works perfectly for this mix, what we're going for. The drums sitting back a little bit with a more natural vibe. So let's hear what the room track just sounded like on its own. So even just with nothing on it, it sounds great. So we've got the 1176 with the room preset here. So it's 4-1, fairly slow attack and fast release. So not only are we getting some nice extra attack from our kick and snare here, but listen to how the length of the decay, the sustain, and the ambience of the room is brought up here with this compressor. Especially that snare, you can just hear that tail just be extended and brought up. It's almost like, I hardly even need to add extra reverb to this because it's got such a nice snare tail. And then EQ wise, not doing much here. It already sounds great. I don't want to mangle it too much. All I'm doing here is adding a little bit of mid-range, so 2.5 dB at 1K, just trying to help get this room tone to cut through the mix a little bit. And then we're doing a tiny dip here around 600 here, just to get rid of a little bit of boxiness. Hear how we push it forward a little bit with that 1K boost. Let's hear it in context with the rest of the drums. Subtle EQ, but it just helps to push the room forward a little bit in the drum mix. So this is obviously playing a huge role. Here's the thing, there is a trade-off here, because when you use a room track like this and more ambience, you push the drums back in the mix. That's okay. So, like I've been saying, I wanted that natural, organic vibe, that roomy drum sound, and to me that sounds way cooler than having just super punchy close mics on a song like this. Just sounds so awesome there. Let's go to our drum bus again. I ended up brightening these up at 12K here, just with a little bit of a shelf here. Pretty subtle. And then, as you've seen in some of the other videos, I would have a Crane Song Phoenix here at the end to thicken up with some saturation. In this case, I'm finding the decapitator with just a little bit of drive here, so just at 1, and then we're using the A mode here, and that's it. So let's check out what this is doing, just thickening up and saturating our drums a bit. To me, we just get a little bit more life, a little bit more fullness and thickness with this plugin. So this is working really well for me for both subtle saturation and, a little bit of distortion as well in more aggressive scenarios.